I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Ukraine launches the largest drone attack on Moscow of the war, we assess the latest battlefield developments as Kyiv seeks to take advantage of its incursion into Russia. Plus, we look deeper at the crisis in Donbass and reflect on how soldiers' equipment has evolved over the course of the conflict.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 21st of August, 2 years and 184 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, Senior Foreign Correspondent Roland Oliphant, and dialing in from Colorado, Anne Robles of the NGO Ukraine Frontline, whose organisation delivers resources to soldiers on the front lines. We started, however, with the latest updates from the battlefields of Ukraine and Russia. Over to Dom.
Well, hi, Francis. Hi, team. So, straight into Kursk. Additional advances there being made by Ukrainian forces. More reporting of Ukrainian first-person view drones targeting Russian engineering and logistic elements, trying to build pontoon bridges over the River Seine. That's after the three main bridges linking that pocket of land to the west of Sudza to the rest of Kursk Oblast were destroyed over the weekend. Now, Russian mill bloggers are saying Ukrainian forces seized Vizhnevka. That's about 5, 6, 7-ish Ks southwest of Koronevo. Now, if correct, that would mean that Ukraine has closed that gap up to the river. Remember, this pocket of land, it's roughly box-shaped. The southern and the western sides of it are the border with Ukraine. The bit along the top is the river. And then so that open flank to the east, I was suggesting in the last few days that if Ukrainian forces were able to push up there, then they would trap any Russian forces left inside that box. Well, it looks as if they have managed that. There are lots of tributaries in the area. There's a lot of rivers, a lot of waterways are wiggling all about. So I can't say that it's absolutely entirely passable to military vehicles, but I think it would be extremely unlikely an armoured force of any significant size would get through there unmolested. Now, the Institute for the Study of War, US-based think tank, they're saying that those reports, the ones from the Russian mill bloggers talking about Vizhnevka, they are consistent with what the Russian MOD has been putting out earlier this week. You may remember on Monday, that was the first sign. They tacitly acknowledged that Ukrainian advances had been made in the Vizhnevka area. Now, quite a few Russian mill bloggers were also saying yesterday that Ukrainian forces are launching mechanized assaults on the outskirts of Koronevo. Mechanized assault being armoured vehicles to fire the infantry into the battle accompanied by tanks, as opposed to, so in infantry fighting vehicles, not just armoured personnel carriers, battle taxis as they're sometimes known. So a mechanized assault would be tanks and infantry fighting vehicles that can have troops in the back but can also act as a fire platform in their own right. The suggestions are that Russian forces are conducting artillery and airstrikes in the region to contain those Ukrainian advances. I'll say that last bit again. Russia is firing artillery into and bombing its own land 2.5 years after launching their lightning 3-day offensive to take Ukraine. Worth mentioning twice, I think. Now, geolocated footage shows Ukrainian forces advancing westward in the open country to the northeast of Koronevo, but also inside the town itself, along or up to the Koronevo-Sudza highway that runs through the sort of east of the town. Now, I think it's quite interesting that Ukraine is choosing to go into that urban area. Koronevo has a few scrappy bits to the sort of south and east, a few houses and what have you dotted along the long straight roads coming out to the southeast. But the main bit of the town is roughly circular with about a 1 kilometre radius. So it's not a small area and not an easy military task to clear through there. However, it's so close to the River Seine sort of takes a sharp turn from running east-west to then going north into the rest of Kursk Oblast. At that point, very close to Koronevo, I think the town could be seen as a kind of gateway into that pocket of land to the west. So I wonder if Ukraine is trying to take the town so it could be a sort of foundation for a very defendable line around the area of Kursk that they've currently seized. Now, elsewhere in Kursk Oblast, Russia seems to have taken back some land in the very far north of where Ukraine's forces seem to have pushed, but also Kyiv's troops have continued to expand their lodgement, particularly to the northeast of Sudza. There was footage yesterday showing Ukrainian forces towing a captured Russian T-90M tank to the southeast of Koronevo. Now, it's still very difficult to verify a lot of this reporting and to give any accurate indication of geographic movements. However, I was somewhat cheered to see that our assessments, what we've been reporting for the last few days, were supported by a map depicting the situation in Kursk Oblast used by Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief, General Alexander Syrsky, during a briefing yesterday. So I think we are there or thereabouts with what we are reporting in terms of geography, unless, of course, he's doing a super massive double bluff and had the map in the background that bore no relation to reality on the ground. But I think if that's the case, then we will just have to give up and start guessing. But I think we are pretty accurate in what we are displaying to you. Now, ISW, this is an interesting one. Stick with me. It's a bit wonkish, but please do stick with me. ISW is saying that the Russian military command continues to complicate and bureaucratize the thus far ineffective command and control structure that Russia has put in place for the Kursk emergency on their part. Now, you've got to get command and control right, as in which units report where, who can tell who to do what, basically. You've got to get the command and control right, or else everything goes off half-cocked. Now, ISW reporting that there was a meeting held yesterday in the Russian MOD whereby Defense Minister Andrei Bulasov appointed Russian Deputy Defense Minister Colonel General Yevkurov as deputy head of a new thing called the Coordinating Council within the MOD for military and security issues in Bryansk, Kursk and Belgorod oblasts. He said Yevkurov is already in Kursk Oblast. Now Yevkurov, was thought to be heading up Russia's Africa Corps. He's been the face of Russia's military outreach and cooperation with African countries since the dissolution of the Wagner Group in 2023, or it was brought into the new Africa Corps. There has been speculation Yevkurov was removed from his position as head of the Africa Corps and that Moscow was temporarily deprioritizing defense cooperation in Africa in response to the Kursk incursion. You may remember back in July, about 80 Wagner members that are now the Africa Corps and dozens of Malian soldiers were killed over days of fierce fighting in Mali. That was a major embarrassment for Russia. Moscow needs friends in Africa. Not sure if that ambush or those days of fighting was connected to his supposed move. But anyway, he is now supposedly leading this coordinating council with 5 deputies, each responsible for different areas related to the Kursk crisis. Things like logistics, evacuation of civilians, building defences and so on. But Defence Minister Belousov also announced yesterday the creation of new military groupings for Bryansk, Kursk and Belgorod, responsible for protecting civilians from drones and other attacks. And Russia's creating a special task force at the National Defence Control Centre to address other aspects necessary for defence of Bryansk, Kursk and Belgorod regions. So there's lots of new military organisations all doing exciting military stuff in Bryansk, Kursk and Belgorod, but it's the FSB, most definitely not a military organisation, that Putin has put in charge of running the whole kick Ukraine out of Russia thing. Now, if it sounds confusing, that's because it is. This is not me just doing a ho-ho-ho, look at all the silly Russians thing. This stuff matters. And unless command and control is sorted out, it will have a negative impact on Russia's ability to get its act together in Kursk. So we will watch that one with interest. Still in Kursk, or related to, and yesterday the Russian Interior Ministry issued a memo on information security for residents and law enforcement personnel inside Bryansk, Kursk and Belgorod oblasts. The memo advises against using CCTV cameras, saying Ukrainian forces are able to access them remotely. It also warns against using online dating services for similar security concerns. Service personnel are instructed to avoid opening messages or links from unknown contacts and to refrain from using phones with sensitive official or personal data that could fall into enemy hands. And the Russian government also urges citizens not to post videos or live streams on social media, especially on highways shared with military vehicles, because there's been quite a bit of that. Military personnel and law enforcement officers have been encouraged to turn off Telegram's People Nearby feature, remove photos and change nicknames that indicate their affiliation with the military or government. They're advised to conceal personal data, geotags and all that kind of stuff. It just shows the effect that this side of open source intelligence can have on military effect. Okay, next, still in Russia, but up to Moscow, Mayor Sergei Sobyanin said that today Russian air defences had shot down, he said, 10 Ukrainian attack drones overnight near Moscow in what he said was one of the largest attempts to attack Moscow with drones to date. Russia's MOD said 45 Ukrainian drones were destroyed overnight, 11 over Moscow or the Moscow region, 23 over Bryansk, 6 over Belgorod, 3 over Kaluga and 2 over Kursk Oblast. Mr. Sobyanin said there were no damage or casualties, but we can't verify any of that. We know that temporary restrictions were put in place at 3 of Moscow's airports, Vnukovo, Domodedovo and Zhukovsky, from about 2:30 this morning to 6:30. That came out of Rosaviasta, the aviation watchdog. And we also know that Ukrainian forces, well, they say they've struck a Russian S-300 air defense system near Novoshakhtinsk in Russia's Rostov Oblast last night. That's about 100 k's due east of Donetsk city. It's just over the border inside Russia. That came from Ukraine's General Staff reporting this morning. Elsewhere, continued minimal gains in the Donbass. There are reports Russia has relocated some units outside of that eastern area for the Kursk operation. And it does seem that there's very little happening away from the area in the vicinity of Pokrovsk. Not a lot happening there anyway, but very little happening elsewhere up and down the line in terms of ground movement. Ukraine say their air defences shot down 50 of 69 Shahed-type drones last night, as well as one Kh-59 or 69 cruise missile. The Air Force said another 16 Russian drones were also lost, likely due to electronic warfare, but they didn't confirm exactly where they were or what they hit. And then just finally, Francis, that fuel tank explosion, we've been tracking it for a couple of days now. The fuel tank explosion at the Proletask oil depot has now been burning for 4 days straight. We'll keep an eye on that. I think we need to get a lettuce in the office and see if it rots before the fire is extinguished, but that's still going strong. And I'll take a pause there.
Thanks, Dom. Now, in what may be clever expectation management by Moscow, or a stark admission of their remarkable failure to get a grip on Ukraine's incursion into Kursk, Kremlin officials have told Russian media that it believes Kyiv's assault on Kursk will last for months. Officials interviewed by Meduza, that Russian outlet based in Latvia, said the estimate is quite optimistic, that's one word for it, if everything goes well. The Kremlin has also reportedly readopted measures used during the COVID-19 pandemic, in which citizens were told to prepare for a new normal. Now, this could, as I say, be about the strength of the Ukrainians, so that when they start pushing Kyiv's forces back there, they can claim it's weeks ahead of schedule. That expectation management, for obvious reasons, was something Kyiv didn't manage to achieve before its counteroffensive last year, hence why it was so damaging when it didn't deliver decisive breakthroughs on the battlefront. Part of that failure, of course, and potentially the cause of failures around this incursion, if it doesn't quite achieve its fundamental objectives, would be due to Western failures to fulfill their pledges to Kyiv. And on that, another update is that US media report today how several NATO countries have already failed to meet pledges reportedly made to Ukraine at last month's Washington summit. At least 5 air defense systems that were promised have not yet been delivered, Bloomberg reported yesterday. It comes after Zelensky called out the UK, the US and France over their slowing support. That's a direct quote from him. And just to remind listeners of what he said, there are no vacations in war. Decisions are needed, as is timely logistics for the announced aid packages. Now, meanwhile, Putin's nothing to see here world tour continues, with Putin landing in Chechnya yesterday after dipping into Azerbaijan to have a sip of their black tea. He was talking to delegates there before meeting Ramzan Kadyrov, Chechnya's leader, on his first visit to the region since 2011. Kadyrov was rumoured to be unwell several months ago, but he's very much back if he was, and it may well have just been not accurate. It remains a key Kremlin ally, Chechnya, deploying thousands of its fighters to help the Russian president in Ukraine. Footage posted by RIA Novosti news agency and Kadyrov showing the Russian president shaking hands with the warlord and other officials after alighting from a helicopter in Grozny, that's the region's main city. Putin then put an arm around Kadyrov's shoulder and hugged him before they got into a limousine together. Why now? Well, this will be something we're hoping to talk about with expert James Kilner the next time he's on the podcast, but there is speculation that there are three main purposes behind this. First, to underscore there's no reason for alarm given events in Kursk and that Putin's calendar is unchanged. Second, to remind the domestic public in Russia of Putin's strength. After all, he launched the Second Chechen War in 1999 while still Prime Minister, which helped define his strongman reputation and made him popular with many Russians. And third and last, again, for a domestic audience, to underline that he is taking a strong stance on terrorism, something Kadyrov knows a lot about after stamping out. Sorry, he might smell a bit, I don't know. He does look like he could do with a beard wash. Lingering rebellions in the country and any forms of dissent, frankly, as well, over his years of rule, something that the Russians call terrorism. Indeed, on the trip, Putin likened the invasion of Kursk to a terrorist attack, namely the 2004 Beslan school massacre in which 330 people died in a hostage siege. To quote Putin directly, "Just as we fought the terrorists, today we have to fight those who are carrying out crimes in the Kursk region. But just as we achieved our goals then in the fight with terrorism, we will achieve these goals also in the direction in the fight with neo-Nazis, and we will undoubtedly punish the criminals. There can be no doubt of that." No surprises there, of course. Putin has blamed Kyiv as being responsible for the concert hall terrorist attack back in March, despite there being no evidence the Ukrainians were implicated at all. Now, just a couple of other quick stories before we hear from Roland and our guest Anne in Colorado. Since we talked yesterday about the latest in the Ukrainian parliament with Svetlana Moronets, I just thought it was worth bringing up that the parliament has just voted to join the International Criminal Court, which prosecutes serious criminals, including those implicated in genocide and crimes against humanity. So we know that it's been ratified, the Rome Statute, according to the opposition lawmaker and the government. Now, most European countries are members of the ICC. The United States is not, something we've talked about and addressed in the past. So this should really be seen in the context of the role the ICC has played in this war in drawing attention to war crimes. It was the ICC, lest we forget, which put an arrest warrant out for Putin due to the kidnapping of children. So it's important to understand that, of course, the Kyiv administration is trying to get closer to all of these Western bodies, the EU, the ICC, etc., to symbolically show its direction of travel. And it is worth remembering that it is these kind of ties, political, judicial, economic, that are testament to the changing political reality of Ukraine, moving firmly towards that Western orientation in ways that many would consider as irreversible, assuming that Ukraine is able to survive this war and secure a lasting peace. Just always worth bearing that in mind when we focus on the very much day-to-day evolutions. It can be sometimes more difficult to miss or to see, the long-term patterns. And it's those long-term patterns like this that if one were looking again, zoomed out historically, one would say Ukraine has become much closer to the West, much more aligned in so many different areas as a result of this war. And indeed, NATO has become stronger, with Sweden and Finland joining too, lest we forget those things. But that's where we are politically. Now, Roland, thank you again for joining us. You've heard our updates there, and as ever, very keen to hear any reflections you have on any of those. But first of all, I know you focused on Pokrovsk this week, where people are evacuating from the Russian advance. It doesn't seem to have slackened that advance, despite the Kursk incursion. What have you been hearing from your conversations?
Yeah, hello. Good morning, afternoon. Yeah, I've been looking at this. I mean, I'm not in a position to publish anything yet, but I've been having conversations around this over the past few days. And to be absolutely honest with you, I mean, I think all eyes have been on Kursk, and it is very dramatic. I think the situation in Donbass is still potentially critical and possibly made worse by Kursk. I'm not sure you saw that there has been some good straight reporting of this. I'm sure you saw Chris Miller's piece in the FT yesterday, where he quoted a Ukrainian commander saying part of the reason the Russians are enjoying tactical success down there is because ammunition has been diverted to Kursk, that his men are back to rationing shells there for the first time since the US aid package was passed earlier this year, because ammunition has been sent up north. We know that Ukraine has diverted some of its best units to the offensive in Kursk, and as we know, there seems to be there's a double gamble. Both sides are gambling here, right? It's a bit like a yin and yang kind of thing. The Ukrainians seem to be gambling that, look, we can absorb the Russian attack in Donbass, we can slow it down, we can do it without breaking while pursuing and advancing Kursk, and the Russians seem to be gambling that they can absorb the Ukrainian advance in Kursk without diverting and losing their momentum in Donbass. Who's right? I suppose we will see. But yeah, look, I've heard two fairly. So let's give you just the current situation. So if you look at the deep state map, which is obviously it's not up to the minute, it's updated with certain delays, but you're talking about kind of 10 kilometers, 6 miles from the Russian advance to Pokrovsk itself, and that salient that's pointing out, that Russian salient, has been gaining ground much more slowly than the Ukrainians in Kursk, it's true, but there's definitely a proliferation of anecdotal evidence that they've been enjoying more tactical success in the past several days. And if you look at the recent progress, they're these 100-yard advances here and there into little villages. A lot of it over the past couple of days has been on the southern side of that salient rather than directly towards Pokrovsk. To give you an idea of the situation, we know that the local authorities in Pokrovsk have given civilians basically, quite bluntly, 2 weeks to get out. It was the way it was announced seemed very much like a deadline, but it was quite straightforward. It was like, well, you've got 2 weeks basically. That's how long you've got to get your stuff together. And speaking to people who've been there in the past 24 hours, it sounds like the kind of scenes we've seen elsewhere. Since the beginning of the war. Going back to the evacuations out of Chasiv Yar, even before that Bakhmut, before that up in Severodonetsk in the spring of 2022. It surprises me I can even remember that far back. Authorities organising buses and working out where the children's families and stuff and so on. I would, going on past experience, I'd expect within a couple of weeks you're going to be down to the usual kind of holdouts. Those who don't want to go, those who can't go, the very old, elderly, the very poor, the disabled, and those who are just refusing to leave because that's where they are, that's where they want to stay. Maybe some of them are actually quite looking forward to the Russians getting there. There is usually a minority like that in places like this. But on the other part of the Donbass, of course, we heard the news that New York, we believe, is pretty much fallen, or most of it has been taken by the Russians. So that advance towards Toretsk continues. That means Toretsk is the next large settlement in that line of advance. Now Toretsk it's built on a ridge, right? It's not indefensible, and it's got, unlike small little villages in this part of the world which are made up of small single-story cottages, things like that, this is a place that has apartment blocks and such like, which means that it may present more of a challenge to the Russians than smaller places. But nonetheless, once Toretsk goes, then you're up against, the next stop is Konstantinovka, which is the anchor to the Donbass agglomeration of Drushkivka, Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. Now, so where does that leave us? As I said, this is not at all definitive. There's a lot to play for, a lot could change. I've heard basically two views of this, and I'm absolutely not going to stick my head out there and tell you which one I think is correct, but the two views are basically this. One is that the recent Russian gains are due to specific local conditions, things like poorly managed rotation of units, the Russians taking opportunities here and there, and that steps are being taken to address it, and the line may stabilize in the next couple of weeks, that there is an expectation that the Russian advance will be halted, and this, the momentum they've built up will be sapped in a way. The other view is, stepping a bit further back, is that the bottom calculation is that Ukraine has sent troops that it needed down here to fight in Kursk, that they're going to struggle to hold this front, and that the Russians, if you look at the map, this kind of this goblin nose pointing out of the front towards Pokrovsk, it actually creates two kind of crescent-shaped bulges either side of it. In effect, very large Ukrainian salients, and that the expectation is perhaps the Russians may not even seek to take Pokrovsk, right? They might not seek to take the built-up cities which are more formidable, but they might keep advancing in the open ground and seek to induce by the end of summer or by the autumn a more general Ukrainian retreat, both to the south and to the north of that salient. As I say, many unknowns and so on and so forth. I'm speaking without any kind of access whatsoever to either the Ukrainian or Russian high command or the reserves available to them. But it is definitely, the Battle of Donbass continues and is a very serious battle to keep in mind while we're talking about Kursk.
Thank you for summarising that conundrum, Roland. I think that really gets to the essence of the debate around Kursk and its implications and potentially not implications on the front in Ukraine. Now, just moving on slightly, but still relevant to Kursk, as you wrote this piece with Verity Bowman over the weekend, who Dom interviewed on the podcast on Monday about the prisoner exchange issue. Are there any updates that you've heard since then, or is there anything you'd like to add on that important issue?
No, I haven't heard much. The thing that caught my eye, the reason we wrote that story was because you could see the Ukrainians at pains to publicise taking prisoners, part of which is simply triumphalist propaganda, right? You publish your victories, you publish videos of you blowing up Russian tanks, and you always say publish videos of capturing Russian soldiers, because that's what you do and it's to be expected. But there are an awful lot of them. They put a great emphasis on it. Zelensky talked about replenishing the exchange fund, as he calls it, and there are a specific kind of slew of videos that started appearing on Telegram from various Ukrainian units. It looked very coordinated, in which Russian prisoners of war were clearly being coerced. A lot of them just captured, shell-shocked, quite frightened guys, speaking to the camera, giving their names and units and begging to be exchanged specifically for Azov fighters, Azov prisoners. That kind of caught my eye. I don't know how far up the chain of command that decision was, or whether that was a plan, whether it's just a thing the soldiers have come up with themselves, but there was definitely a kind of coordinated effort to get that kind of message out there. We know that the fate of those prisoners, of the Azov guys in particular, who have been in captivity for well over 2 years now, it's a bit of a domestic political issue inside Ukraine. It would be a major win if President Zelensky was able to bring those guys home, but obviously they're sensitive to the Russians, so you're going to need a lot of prisoners in order to gain the leverage to bring them home in the exchanges. So it seems to me that was one of the key objectives of this offensive. I think that's why you've seen so many prisoners taken. I also think, to be frank with you, Dom as the professional soldier here may have a different view, I don't know, but just in my conversations with people, I get the impression that in the kind of trench warfare you're seeing elsewhere, to be absolutely brutally frank, prisoners often simply are not taken by either side, partly because in trench warfare there's just not time, or you don't have enough people with you to stop and bother with that kind of thing. And I suspect that because it was such a fast maneuver, because so many forces were involved, that might be one reason why so many prisoners were taken in comparison to that kind of grinding fight we're seeing down in Donbass or elsewhere on the line. Nothing further to update. We know these negotiations are shrouded in secrecy by both sides. They're very sensitive. You generally don't know they're happening until they're announced. So if there is any progress on that, we'll update you.
Well, thank you very much, Roland. And we'll come back to you, of course, for your final thoughts and any other general reflections that you've got at the end of the episode. And indeed, if Dom has any thoughts on that prisoner issue as well, then, of course, welcome that in final thoughts. But time now to go to our guest, Anna Robles of Ukraine Frontline, an organisation that started with toothbrushes in a suitcase and now they're delivering drones. We've heard from the organisation before. Thank you so much for coming back on. First of all, just for those who didn't hear the first time, how did you get from one to the other, and what have you been up to recently? It seems that a lot has changed since we last heard from you.
Yes, hello, Francis. Thank you so much for inviting me back on the podcast to give you an update. So As a recap, with Ukraine Frontline, we started as basically just a handful of people that really wanted to help get aid to Ukraine. We had a friend in Kyiv named Nicholls, who is the one that was doing deliveries of items and requests that we would send to him. From there, it turned into a nonprofit. So we are a certified nonprofit in the United States that would allow us to be able to better fundraise, provide tax breaks to people who donated us in the United States. And then as we started to grow, we started to progress into providing TACMED, most requested items being chest seals and cat tourniquets, because the highest quality ones are sourced here in North America, and we can order them directly from North American Rescue Essentials and ensure that they are not the knockoff ones that they were having an issue with for a while there. We were able to get those over and delivered to medics on the front line. When I came on the podcast last year and did an introduction and talked about our mission and what we were working on, that really gave us a lot of exposure and opened up a lot of different avenues for us to not only receive an influx of donations, but also to meet other NGOs and partner with them. There's a lot of small NGOs out there, and there's power in numbers. So we like to group up with them and do joint fundraisers and see how we can help each other out. So from there, being able to make those connections and that increase in donations, we were able to progress to more higher cost items from the requests that were coming in. And they really have evolved through time. It started out with basic hand warmers, socks, chest seals, tourniquets, those emergency Mylar blankets, to reflect now what's going on on the battlefield. So we're getting a lot of requests for drones, and not just like we do stick to a philosophy that we are non-lethal aid. We do not provide weaponry or anything to that extent. So anything that we do provide is going to be a matter of defense, to either help save lives of soldiers on the field through drone jammers or through TACMED. So with Russia catching up to Ukraine's progress with utilizing the drone warfare, there's been an increased need for drone jammers. So that's an example of something that we've been able to provide, or generators to keep these things powered on the battlefield. So that's how that has progressed, and where we have gone from basically a bunch of us on a Discord server trying to get stuff to our friend in Kyiv, to working with a variety of different units throughout Ukraine and making a lot of really good connections to help us further our cause.
Thank you so much for that update. Really interesting. And indeed, you already answered one of my questions, which is about how troops' requests have changed over time. And it's interesting to hear that jammers are now one of the top requests. Another question I have is, have you seen any evidence of a shift in how you engage with, if you have many interactions with, the Ukrainian government, whether local or national? As long-standing listeners will know, this has been something that has been an open question now for some time from the many organisations and charities operating in Ukraine, and indeed strategists as well, thinking militarily. There have been criticisms that have been made that whilst early on in the war, it was very advantageous for there to be a bottom-up sort of insurgent, lots of different organisations working, but not necessarily organised and coordinated from top down, that actually, as the war has gone on, has become something of an impediment, and that there does need to be a little bit more strategic coordination that is top down from the national government and perhaps even from local regional government. Have you seen any evidence of a change? And of course, feel free to say no. It's very interesting to understand whether there has, or whether the understanding is still that it prefers there to be, as it were, a groundswell of organisations doing their own thing that are being successful, and they want to keep their hands off, that's more of a successful model. Very interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I would say, from our perspective, we have not seen anything, although we have heard there's been conversation about different ways that we've gotten on the radar of the government and everything that we're helping with. We are really small, and like I said, we really stick to, we're fulfilling requests for TACMED and non-lethal aid. And that's what we are. Our goal is, we're not exporting anything that we shouldn't be, or importing anything that we shouldn't be. We're sticking to exactly what we know will not be potentially an issue, because that's out of our purview. That's not what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to really get down to, we're fulfilling the requests of these units that are not able to traditionally get some of the supplies that they need. There is, and I think that groundswell, as you mentioned, has not really gone away. I think that, especially since getting more active in the Twitter community, after I did my initial interview and becoming part of the NAFO organization, there's a lot of people that are doing fundraisers that are attached to specific units, and there's constantly fundraisers being posted on Twitter for people that are trying to source any and all requests by the troops. And so we're not trying to get big enough that we would need involvement from the Ukrainian government. We are strictly a U.S. NGO. We have partnered with a Ukrainian NGO, so Renegade Relief Runners, whom you guys interviewed previously, they are a Ukrainian NGO, and therefore, like, if we need to partner with them, they can advise on the legalities and help us with that to make sure that we're compliant in any area like that, because that is their expertise, and that's where we get that power in numbers. Like I was saying, being able to partner up with somebody that's in Ukraine, has the Ukrainian language experts, the ones that can interpret the different laws, because there are different laws that are requirements, so they're able to assist us with that. But as far as any type of top-down regulations that have directed us impactly, we have not come across anything like that as of late.
That's very interesting. Thank you. And just staying on this theme for one more question, and then I've got one other, and I'll open it up to Dom and Roland. How do you, as it were, prioritize? You said that obviously there's a huge community out there that are flagging when there are units that need particular material. How do you just prioritize which ones are most urgent and which ones perhaps are still urgent but less urgent than others, as it were? What's your process of determining that?
So we have set units that we work with, and what we're able to do is things that we can fulfill on our own. If we have the funds to fulfill it and it comes from a unit that we work with regularly, we will usually hold a board vote right away and approve it. I don't think we've ever gotten together in our board meetings and said no to any request that's come in, so to speak, as long as it's coming from a unit that we work with regularly, that we've vetted, and we have the funds for. If there's situations where we're getting larger requests, and then that's when we'll start to partner with other NGOs and do joint fundraisers. So I think that the priority would be the ones that we have an established relationship with, we've delivered to before, we have vetted and know that they are legitimate, they're Ukrainian. We try to really support some of the smaller units that don't necessarily have a huge social media presence. There's some units and some that are able to source more materials and more money based on their connections, and other ones that are smaller that aren't able to do that. And we're really trying to help everybody, but also help out those that don't necessarily have people that are available to do social media promotion, because that's, interestingly enough, something that has really come from this. Is there's a lot of different soldiers and that have been able to get on social media and use that as a platform to raise money. So we do sometimes place preference in those that don't normally have that we can help out. And if it comes to a point where we are trying to source a request that is pretty significant from a cost perspective, that's when we start to do joint fundraising with other organizations. We've got a fundraiser right now going on. We've partnered with the Doshka Foundation and Renegade Relief Runners to do a fundraiser to raise money to purchase more what we call the fancy TACMed that's a little bit more expensive. An example being interosseous devices. These are devices with very long needles that are used in combat medicine. They're unable to establish an IV the traditional route. They can take these and insert them into the bone, as grisly as that sounds, and they can administer medications and provide fluid that way. So they're more expensive. So we're trying to get that over and fulfill those requests that are coming from the medics. So we've got the three of us that have a joint fundraiser right now. We've got one of our president is going to be going over there in the next couple weeks to deliver those. I went over in July myself and delivered quite a large request of TACMed, including those. And like I said, that's when we do the joint fundraisers for those that, if we don't have the capability to fulfill on our own and would otherwise have to say, I'm sorry, we don't have that, or we can help, but on a very minimal level. That's where we get that power in numbers and we partner up together.
Thank you. And just one final question from me was connected to that issue of costs that you just brought up there. You talked about how the requests have changed. Have you found that the cost of that equipment has changed? As the war has advanced, have the requests become more technical and therefore more expensive? Or does it remain really the most of the stuff that is being requested is quite basic stuff, but you just need more of it?
I would say the former. As requests change throughout this, as things evolve, they are becoming more sophisticated and therefore more expensive, which I think is a testament to the evolution of how the Ukrainians are adapting onto the battlefield and fighting and evolving from just using some of the basic stuff to their medics are becoming a lot more advanced and highly trained, and therefore requesting stuff that's a little bit more sophisticated that we want to get to them. And the evolution of getting sock warmers and generators, basic solar banks to the troops too. Now they need to have an inverter and they need to have a jammer, and we're sourcing trucks from Europe. So it definitely has gotten more expensive as it's evolved, but we don't find that as a negative thing because it just means that we just need to adapt and figure out ways to fundraise to achieve those goals. It does mean that from a quantities perspective, that what we carry over, some of our loads get a little bit lighter because it's a little bit more expensive. I've been over 3 times since last year. 2 of those trips that I went over there, I mean, they are self-funded, so I'm not using NGO money to make deliveries. But every time I go over there, I've got quite a few suitcases stuffed full of requests that have come in that I then deliver to Renegade Relief Runners. And they've been, like I said, with the things becoming more expensive and the quantity going down a little bit, I was able to fill my Renegade Relief Runners requests with 2 suitcases this time. However, I did just kind of the power and numbers thing. If any of us are going over and taking stuff with us to deliver, especially the TACMED is a lot of what we take over to deliver, since a lot of that is ordered in North America. My partner, Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, had reached out and said, we've got some stuff that upload a TACMED that needs to come over. Are you able to help us out? And I said, sure, let's do 2 bags worth. And 2 weeks later, I had 9 boxes of TACMED from a North American rescue at my door that I was then unpacking and repacking into duffel bags. So, and then bringing that over, which saves a substantial amount of time from a shipping perspective and a cost perspective. So there's still that need for the basics, but so we're always bringing over the basic tourniquets and chest seals are the most requested items. But yes, I would say that there has been an evolution in cost due to the increased value of the items that are needed.
Hi, Anne. Dom here. Delighted to chat to you. Lovely to chat again. Last saw you in Colorado last year when we were having dinner with John Spencer. I'm interested in how we've talked about how the request has changed, but as you say, you're very focused on non-lethal stuff and very important but sort of lower level bits and pieces to keep the troops happy. Have they offered any opinion as to why 2.5 years into this thing they are still having to lean very heavily onto organisations such as yours for quite basic stuff, especially on the maybe not the medical stuff, although I'd say tourniquets are quite basic really, but just on the nice to have, as you say, the stuff that will keep them warm, the socks and the other personal items. Are they expressing any dissatisfaction with their own sort of logistics systems for not having been able to provide this?
I will have to say that I have not had any direct conversations with those on the front lines. However, I think that from my understanding and the conversations that I've had with other NGOs, it's been difficult for the Ukrainian government to get some of these basics things out quickly, because a lot of the stuff that's coming in, they're really focused on getting those high-powered weaponry, requesting the HIMARS and ATACMS and getting the F-16s. Like, that's kind of stuff that they desperately need. And I think that because that is really in the forefront of what is occurring, that then it makes it difficult to then fulfill some of these other requests. And it really can depend from unit to unit. I can't speak in depth about the structure of how the Ukrainian military is set up. I've heard things, but I don't think that I have any authority to speak on that. But a lot of it is there's just Initially, when the war started, there was a huge influx of reactivated reservists and people that were enlisting for the first time that wanted to help fight. That just overnight, to have your military kind of expand like that, it makes it difficult sometimes to just be able to have the money to just fulfill all these requests. So, but numbers have dwindled. I think that basically I couldn't tell you exactly, and I have not heard any dissatisfaction, but I also haven't had any direct conversations with them regarding why they're leaning so heavily on us. I just know that it's a need for them, and NGOs like Ukraine Frontline or Renegade Relief Runners really are just paramount still in providing these and fulfilling requests. And we don't plan on stopping as long as we've got people that are willing to partner with us and willing to provide donations to help keep us afloat, then we will be fulfilling these requests. And until this war has resolved and peace has been restored.
Sure. Thank God there are people like you out there doing this repeatedly over and over. I just, finally for me, what's the mood in Colorado, where you are, and the wider US that you're able to lean into? Because I know Ukraine Frontline is not just in Colorado; it's other states as well. So, how have you detected, or what's been the change in the messaging you're getting from folks in terms of their support, or the questions that are being asked? Are people showing greater interest in what you're doing and the war? Are people asking about the corruption allegations, for example, about the government and how you work through all that? But what's the mood music amongst the sort of the NGO sector, or the support for the NGO sector in Colorado and the US?
So I would say that the mood has, people are still very excited when they hear that I support Ukraine. I make it very obvious, especially within my work environment. In my office, I have a Ukrainian flag hanging at my desk. I am very vocal in talking about I'm going to Ukraine and this is what I'm doing. And I get a lot of interest and requests and people that are like really surprised, and they're like, you're going over there? And really asking questions about what it's like. Is it safe? And I try to bring it up with as many people as I can to make sure that people are aware that there is still a conflict over there. There's still a war. There's still fighting. There's still a desperate need for our support. But it's tough because, and I say this with love and affection towards my fellow Americans, we can have a pretty short attention span, which is unfortunate because it makes it so once it fades from the headline news, then it's out of sight, out of mind, which is why we're constantly trying to keep active on social media. All of us are trying to speak about what we do in the locations that we're at to be able to help fulfill these requests. When we try to, I know that there's always corruption allegations. When I'm asked about that, I simply say what I know, and that is Zelensky has made it a top priority to root those out. He's not going to tolerate it, and when they're discovered, it's handled. We do everything we can to protect ourselves as far as doing a lot of deliveries. We flying over there, handing stuff off, making sure that we're dotting all our I's, crossing all our T's. But I will say that is something that it can be frustrating. And I've noticed that the mood in Ukraine can reflect sometimes where the United States is at with providing aid. So when I went over there in April, for instance, and I made a delivery to Renegade Relief Runners, and I was visiting with my friend in Ukraine, who I finally got to meet last year. I was there about 2 weeks before Speaker Johnson decided that he was no longer going to sit on that bill. And there definitely was a sense of frustration and like, why is this happening? And it's hard as an American. Don't have the power to control my government from that level. As a voter, I can vote, but I can't go to DC and personally make Speaker Johnson put this bill to vote. And I'd have to explain that. And that can be frustrating too. So I think that Americans still overall are in support of helping Ukraine, and it's just not at the forefront of their minds. And therefore, that's where a lot of us are coming in to try to just remind people that we're here. And we do work not just within the United States. We do have a German operative who we call Archist, and he is able to access a lot of the stuff in Europe and source it. That it's, for instance, like the night vision and the high tech, the drone stuff and the jammers and all of that, he's able to source through his contacts in Europe and get that sent over. There is a sense that it's been going on for a long time, and we really want to be able to make a difference and help. And sometimes it's just it can be frustrating with how slow things are going. And that is definitely reflected. I think that people wish that we were able to do more.
Well, thank you very much, Anne of Ukraine Frontline. We'll have the links in the show notes to all of your work. It's time now for our final thoughts. I'll come to you at the end, Anne. But first of all, Roland, what do you want to leave our listeners with?
Hello, I think I'm just going to reiterate that I'm going to be keeping a very close eye on what's happening down in Donbass, down on the Eastern Front. And I'm quite worried about it, to be honest. But there's another thing that I'd like to leave you with as well, is that Twitter reminded me a few days ago that it was the 10th anniversary, 10 years ago, this week or last week, I can't remember the exact day. I was driving around Russia's Rostov region and stumbled across a Russian armoured column moving into Ukraine. It was the first proof of the first Russian invasion of Ukraine. And given that Ukrainians have gone the other way, the other part of my thought is to remember again that there are no rules of hard and fast prediction in war. There's swings, there's roundabouts, and there's a lot of surprises. So despite my rather doom-laden kind of prognosis earlier, expect to be surprised.
Well, thank you very much, Roland, for that. Really interesting, as always, to hear your perspective. Dom Nicholls, you next.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. Some bizarrely and completely unplanned. I'm going to offer very similar thoughts to what Roland's just saying. So today's August the 21st. It is exactly 56 years ago today that in 1968 the Soviet military invaded then Czechoslovakia. Hundreds of thousands of troops, backed up by tanks and aircraft, rolled over the border, and the invasion stopped Alexander Dubček's Prague Spring liberalization reforms, left the country under suffocating control by Moscow for at least another, about 20 years. So today I note with interest that T-72 variants gifted to Ukraine by Czechia are in action today inside Russia. And just as Roland was saying, there is no inevitability to Russian success in this war. A lot of people seem to think there is. The idea that Putin has endless resources to wage this war is flawed. I think Czechia's example of 56 years separating the Soviet invasion of 1968 to having their own tanks in action in Russia today shows that nothing in history is certain, just as Roland was saying. And if there's any doubt about that, I'll refer you to Roland's comments, but also I'm just going to repeat the words I said earlier in my notes, because I'm just staggered that Russia is firing artillery onto and bombing its own land 2.5 years after launching their lightning 3-day offensive to take Ukraine.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for that. And a real pleasure to have you on from Colorado. What are your final thoughts for us?
So we do have on our Twitter a link to a raffle that we are doing for a Ukrainian flag signed by probably one of the last ones that he signed before stepping down as the defense minister. So if you go to UA Frontline is our Twitter handle. We do weekly raffles. Usually we call it $2 Tuesday. So these raffle tickets for this flag signed by Zaluzny are $2 each, but there's no limit to how many you can buy. My final thought for today is I just wanted to touch on, a lot of people will ask, is what you're doing really making a huge impact, especially because you're not able to provide any of the lethal aid as far as guns and sourcing weapons. If I was able to be a weapons distributor, I wouldn't be doing my day job. But anyway, and so just know that all of your donations and all the support that you provide us allows us then to support Ukraine, and it is making a difference.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following us on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war continues, we're relying on your support more than ever. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X, formerly known as Twitter. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Giles Gear. Executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.